Rockets and Knicks were in Game 5 when O.J. started that fateful drive. His four-way hazard lights were blinking, and no one knew what the Jews was thinking.
I've been to Reno, Chicago, Fargo, Minnesota, Buffalo, Toronto, Winslow, Sarasota, Wichita, Tulsa, Ottawa, Oklahoma, Tampa, Panama, Mattawa, La Paloma, Bangor, Baltimore, Salvador, Amarillo, Tocopilla, Barranquilla, and Padilla. I'm a killer. I've been everywhere, man. I've been everywhere, man. Cross the desert bare, man. I breathe the mountain air, man. I've traveled, I've had my share, man. I've been everywhere.
This is Oversight Live, your advocate for good governance. We're putting the site back in. Oversight. Here's the watcher on the wall, your host, Ben Carpenter.
All right, got myself unmuted. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is Oversight Live, and we are going to bring you pertinent information from our nation's capital on subjects concerning the legislature and Alaskans and finances and all of the above. Tonight, we're going to have a conversation based on a forum that occurred last week. It was put on by ISER, which is the what do they call it? The Institute of Social and Economic Research out of the University of Alaska, Anchorage. You can click on the link there and it'll take you to their website. So the governor asked ISER to put together an update to a briefing or a form that they put on in 2016 that was financially related. And so that's what this is all about. This following up with some information that they provided legislature and Alaskans a decade ago on fiscal topics. And we'll get to some clips here. I'm not going to show, we don't have time to show the whole thing, but I will show some clips. We do have the opportunity, if what you see tonight is something that's interesting to you and you want more information, ISER will be having a webinar on February 4th. That'll be 4 p.m. Alaska Standard Time. And again, the topic's going to be the analysis of the state fiscal options, similar to the presentation that we're going to review parts of tonight. You will need to register for that webinar, and here is the link below. If you want to click on that and go to their website and register to participate in that webinar, then you can do that. If you've got questions for me after this, while you're watching or afterwards, when you're watching the recording, you can email me at producer@oversightlive.com. I will do my best to answer questions in a timely manner. While the show's going, you can text your questions to me or your comments. We're streaming on Facebook, X, and YouTube. And if you enter in a message in your chat there on the live show, it will come to me and we'll be able to respond. And I'll do my best to do so. Anyway, so let's be judicious with our time here and get started. We've got a number of clips here that I'm going to show you and commentate if needs be. So here we go with the introduction, kind of setting the stage for what we got going on here at ISER.
I'm Diane Hirschberg, and I am the director for ISER, Institute of Social and Economic Research. And we are really honored that you are choosing to be with us this morning for this presentation. where we're sharing what I consider to be very important work that's been done by a great team of researchers, both at ISER and beyond. I'm going to introduce the team members in a moment, but first I want to acknowledge and thank the governor's office. The governor requested this work. This is us revisiting work that was done in 2016, and you all are, of course, you all who are legislators are facing a really critical moment in our state to make some hard decisions. And so we were asked to try to give you some of the data. I'm Diane Hirsch.
That's Diane from ISER. If you're just joining us and want to recap, we're going to be watching the presentation that they presented here on the 29th, last Thursday. And again, if you want to watch this later, you can watch the recording. If you want to join the webinar on the February 4th, you can do that as well. And they'll probably do the similar presentation and possibly take questions. I don't know what their format is. Anyway, so the governor has asked ISER to put together this information presentation on economic options for the state of Alaska. So I'm going to move to I wanted to also say that she spoke about hard decisions, and I remember conversations in beginning of the legislature that I served in 2019 that we were talking about hard decisions that needed to be made, and to some extent we still have hard decisions that need to be made. So nothing changes, a lot stays the same. All right, let's move to the next clip here and kind of move in sequence.
Well, thank you to Director Hirschberg and to Governor Dunleavy for the invitation to come out today and to present these results to you. As Diane mentioned, my name is Brett Watson, and I'm an economist at the Institute of Social and Economic Research, where I've worked for about the last 8 years or so now. It was interesting approaching this work because for the last 8 years that I've been at ISER, the questions surrounding Alaska fiscal policy have been persistent. As Diane and the governor mentioned, in 2016, our colleagues Muhsin Gatabi, Gunnar Knapp, and Matthew Berman published a study called The Short-Run Economic Impacts of Alaska Fiscal Policy. Who remembers maybe some of the discussions around that study? So I see a few hands in the room. So this is not a conversation that is new to many of you. The governor's office approached us in September about potentially updating that study. And I'll say somewhat candidly that I was a little skeptical that if we revisited those numbers, that anything significant would change. And what I hope that you take away from our presentation today is, while the earth hasn't shaken beneath our feet, the conclusions that we come to today are not going to dramatically invalidate those that you may recall from the 2016 study. I think that there are important but potentially subtle differences that we will discuss in just a minute. Just some boilerplate disclaimer language here. As with all ISER research, much of ISER's research is funded by external sponsorship, but ISER maintains independence on that research, meaning that the methodology and the conclusions that are used to conduct and analyze that work are solely based on the discretion of ISER researchers. That's myself and my co-authors in this study. And so any interpretation of these results should be attributed to us and not our institution, not the university, and not the sponsor, in this case, the Office of the Governor. I also want to make the point clear, and I'll reiterate this maybe throughout the presentation, that economic impacts, like the impacts that I'll be sharing with you today, are really just one dimension of policymaking. And there are many other factors that policymakers will need to consider as they weigh fiscal options. We think that economic impacts are one important facet of that conversation, but clearly not the only dimension involved here. Well,
it is interesting to note that ISER is part of the University of Alaska, which has a nexus with the state budget, and yet the governor's office, who is funded by the state budget, has to pay for ISER to have this presentation. So in essence, it appears to the layman that we're paying twice. Yeah, I digress. That's not a main point of tonight's broadcast. All right, next clip. Before we
it's a little painful.
before we start the next clip here, I want to check the chat message here. Hi, Christopher. Glad you're joining us. And oh, my wife left me a nice note that I'm going to keep to myself. JDM, you were thinking of a conflict of interest. I'm not sure whether it's so much a conflict of interest there, or just a double funding requirement. I don't know. I would have to sit down with ISER and ask them where they get their funding from state government. But it just strikes me that a university that's funded largely by government is then charging the government for the products that it produces. Anyway, let's move on here.
It's a little painful to say that 2016 was 10 years ago, but I suppose it is now.
I'm sorry. We don't want to hear that episode or that clip over again. Let's move to the next clip.
So let's turn our attention to the review mirror here. What has happened since 2016 when ISER released this study? Well, there have been many significant changes. Alaska's economy has changed. Our key source of revenue and private sector activity in the petroleum industry has changed, and policy has changed. In terms of what's been going on in our economy is actually diversified. And this is a point that sometimes when I make it in public forums, it surprises people. But if you look at the contributions to either private sector employment or gross domestic product for our state, the contribution of the petroleum industry has been slowly declining over the last 10 years, while the contributions of every other aspect of our economy have been growing. So our economy is diversifying. At the same time, one of the reasons for that diversification is that our visitor industry is growing. That has important implications for potential fiscal policy. And the composition of our non-resident workforce has changed. The types of workers that commute to Alaska to work at our remote mines or up on the North Slope looks different now than it did then. Our petroleum industry is changing. I mentioned that its contribution to private sector activity as a share of the overall economic pie is shrinking. The geography of production on the North Slope is changing. Oil production is opening up in areas that previously hadn't seen much production before, particularly in the Petroleum Reserve of the Arctic, the NPRA, which has implications for fiscal policy as more barrels come out of federal land as opposed to state land. And, for the first time in many decades, we're looking at medium-term forecasted increases in production. Right, Willow and Pika are set to bring online significant new production barrels. That has important implications for fiscal policy. And then finally, the policy landscape has changed. In fact, the year after ISER published the 2016 study, U.S. Congress and the President signed the 2017 Tax Cuts and Job Act. We'll refer to this probably throughout the presentation as TICJA. But that policy has important implications for how the federal government and state governments share the relative burdens of taxation. And of course, over the last 10 years, our state fiscal policy has changed, and that has important implications for what's going on.
All right, so kind of setting the stage here still before we get into the meat and potatoes here, but just want to take a brief second here and say, why are we doing this tonight? Well, here's a presentation with information that the legislature, I have had numerous legislators contact me and say, hey, you need to get this on the show. You need to pay attention to what ISER just said. They've updated their information, meaning the legislature is using it or should or can be using it to determine, the governor just put out a fiscal plan. Well, why did he put out a fiscal plan? This might help explain that. And then why would the legislature take up that fiscal plan or not take up that fiscal plan is a good question here going forward, right? I have seen some tepid response from the Senate in particular about taking up the governor's fiscal plan. So what are we doing tonight? Well, you didn't get the chance to go to this meeting, this informational meeting that happened, but it's information that you need to know. So I'm taking the time to clip it out and provide some information to you so that you understand it. You can choose to turn this off and go sit and watch Netflix, binge on Netflix if you want, but this is going to be beneficial to you in understanding what happens in state government. So for those that are watching live, I appreciate you joining us. We'll be better educated because of it. And for those that are watching on the recording, you too will be educated. All right, let's jump to number 4 clip here.
So let's take a look at those state fiscal policy changes. So this is a chart showing the 10 years before the ISER 2016 analysis and the 10 years after the ISER 2016 analysis. And this is not to make any implied causal relationship here. I'm not suggesting that the ISER 2016 study caused this change, but it happened to occur at a time when there was significant change in the state. In the 10 years before the 2016 analysis, you can see that these are unrestricted general fund expenditures on the left side of the figure. And you can see a strong decline in those UGF expenditures. These are measured in real or inflation adjusted and per capita terms. Prior to 2016, real per capita UGF expenditures were growing at a 6.3% annual rate. Since 2016, real UGF per capita expenditures have been declining at a 1% annual rate. If you compare the FY 2016 budget to the FY26 budget, you'll see that real UGF expenditures declined by about $3 billion over that 10-year period. The contributors to that decline are about a $200 million reduction in the permanent fund dividend appropriation, a $1.1 billion reduction in the state's capital budget, and a $1.7 billion reduction in the state's operating budget. So we've made significant changes over the last 10 years with respect to our state's expenditures. But it's not just expenditures that have...
All right, so I'm going to pause this for just a second. 2 points that I want to make. On the chart, about 2013 is when the price of oil dropped out of the market and our revenues suffered tremendously. So between 2013 on this graph and where the line is, 2016, 2017 timeframe. Not entirely sure which year it was where we expended it completely. That is where UGF spending that's showing on here was largely coming out of, not largely, but a good portion of it was coming out of the constitutional budget reserve. So we were spending out of savings at the time that this was peaking in 2015. This per capita spending is peaking after the oil price dropped, and is peaking because we're tapping into our constitutional budget reserve to keep that spending going. The reality is we don't want to deal, the legislature didn't want to deal with the fact that the price is dropping out of oil and make cuts, make reductions. Okay, second point that I want to make is they're talking not just per capita spending, they're talking real per capita spending. So what's not seen here is what inflation is doing at the same time that the graph is showing spending. So as inflation is growing, it's eating away at the value of the dollar, and thus it has the effect of showing that you're spending less. So keep that in mind. All right, let's continue.
That have changed over the last 10 years. Our state's revenue picture has also changed. There were a couple of key pieces of legislation passed in this period that I think have changed, diversified, and grown the state's revenue picture. The most important of these changes, most certainly, is SB 26, or the percent of market value reform that was passed in the way that the state manages its revenues from the permanent fund. This provided both a new source of general fund spending, but also a new and more diverse source of revenue for the state. Rather than just solely being tied to the fate of the oil industry, the state now had access to this more diversified and broader-based source of revenue that it could tap into. So the state's made important changes both on the expenditure side and on the revenue side, but I think that we recognize that there are still some lingering challenges here. One of the reasons that I think it's important to take this retrospective look, to look in the review mirror a little bit, is when I talk to Alaskans at policy forums, much like this one, when I talk to Alaskans, one of the senses that I get from them is that there's been persistent inaction on this issue of Alaska's fiscal challenge. They feel like there's not a lot of progress that the state has made. But when I look at a couple of these actions that the state has taken on the expenditure side and on the revenue side, I think the state has made some important changes with respect to our state's fiscal policy. And it's important for us to acknowledge those changes as we think about looking forward. Like I said, we have a few challenges that still remain for us, and that's where we want to situate this current work. How do we address some of the lingering challenges with respect to our state's budget in a way that potentially minimizes their impact on the economy? So that's where this analysis comes in. So let's take a look at those state fiscal policy changes.
All right. So if we were not talking real numbers, I think the chart would look significantly different if we were not accounting for inflation in our finances, or in the real spending numbers there. Let's see here. I'm looking at the chats here. Christopher, they won't be drilling up on the North Slope due to the rig tip over. Well, I mean, the rig won't be drilling, but I think they're going to continue doing the drilling other plans with other rigs, I would assume anyway. Kevin Hall, thank you. Hello from Sterling. Good to see you. Thanks for being with us today. Coquito? Arctic Pepper. What an interesting name. Looking forward while forgetting how we got here. We are at now, really. Yeah. So it's interesting that ISER is painting a picture that we've actually decreased spending by 1% since 2016. For those of you that have seen your permanent fund dividend dwindle since 2016, it doesn't feel like state spending has declined or done anything other than grow, right? Again, this is the effect of inflation on everybody, right? It's you, it's me, it's our government. Inflation's a big deal, and it is why it is called that silent tax on people that we don't see. Again, a federal monetary policy issue. You print money, you're going to get inflation. All right. I'm oversimplifying things for the conversation here, but largely it's true. Okay, let's continue. Let's continue. Well, it's there.
So what we did in this work is we analyzed 11 fiscal options that the state might have available to it that met the following criteria: that the state could feasibly implement them, that the state had control over them, and they would present significant fiscal change. So these were not sort of minor changes that nibble around the edges, but more significant and broad changes that would have significant impacts on the state's budget. I'll talk more about these in just a minute. And then we evaluated the impact of 3 variations of these options, which would potentially reduce the effect on the economy. So for each of those options that we evaluated, we looked at a particular set of outcomes. We looked at the distribution of income. So how would lower income and higher income Alaskans be affected by these different fiscal options? We asked the question, who would pay or who would bear the burden of these fiscal options? Would it be Alaska residents, non-residents, including non-resident workers or visitors to our state, or would it be the federal government through reduced federal income tax collections? And then finally, we looked at economic impacts. We looked at how this would affect employment, income, gross domestic product, and population in the state's economy. So let me tell you about, more specifically, the fiscal options that we considered. We considered 3 changes to state spending. We looked at changes in the state's workforce size, a clean capital budget, and when I say clean here, I mean we assumed that no federal matching dollars would be affected. If federal match dollars are implicated in either increases or decreases in the capital budget, these economic impacts would be considerably larger, depending on exactly what the size of the federal match was. So we assume that the capital budget could be affected without affecting federal dollars. And I think reductions in the capital budget today, this would be a tricky puzzle to solve. And we evaluated a clean or operating, broad or operating budget change. So an increase.
Just to pause here and clarify something. You can build a study any way that you want, right? You can pick what it is that you're going to study and how you're going to study it, and the factors and all of the nuances within the study. You could pass judgment on whether the assumptions being made here are good or bad. It isn't, and I don't take it as that when I'm listening to this. It is just the fact that this is what they're being upfront with the assumptions that they made for this study, so that it's very clear to listeners and watchers of the presentation here where they're getting their data from. So reserve judgment on whether it's right or wrong or good or bad to make those assumptions. This is part of their study.
Change. So an increase or a decrease in the operating budget that, again, would not touch any federal dollars. We evaluated 6 revenue options that would change household income. These options included changes to the permanent fund dividend amounts, a broad and a narrow sales tax. And when I say broad, I mean one that would include a large basket of goods and services that are purchased in the economy, with some exceptions for healthcare, education, and a few components of shelter, like rent or mortgage payments. Then we considered a narrower version of that sales tax, which would include the same exclusions that I just mentioned, plus food at home, think groceries. We also considered a flat and progressive income tax, a flat tax being the same tax rate applied to all income earners, the same tax rate regardless of your income level, and then a progressive income tax, much like the federal income tax schedule, which would increase the rate as incomes rose. And then we considered a statewide residential property tax. These 9 options were all the same options that were considered as part of that ISER 2016 study. So what we did in this...
All right, we're going to keep it rolling here.
Generally speaking, you can characterize the impacts on the economy, the broad economic impacts of these fiscal options, and put them into 3 buckets. The first bucket are those with smaller economic impacts. Generally speaking, this is an important caveat, the smallest impacts on the economy or smaller impacts result from business tax changes. So these are changes more narrowly to the petroleum industry or to the broad corporate environment. More moderate changes result from changes to the permanent fund dividend distribution or from broad-based taxes. And then the largest economic impacts result from changes in state spending. Now, remember that ISER did not evaluate business tax changes in 2016, but for the options that ISER did evaluate then, these results are largely consistent with ISER's results from that previous study. Now, I mentioned a big caveat that generally speaking, economic impacts are more muted for these options. Corporate tax changes, contrasting to other options that we're analyzing here, their effects tend to grow over time, or at least persist for longer. For most of these other options, that over time the economy adjusts to changes in fiscal policy. Corporate tax changes, though, have this unique feature that they provide a deterrent to investment in the short run, and that investment, that foregone investment today, means that there's less economic activity that's generated from that investment in the future, and so those changes to the corporate tax structure tend to be more persistent, which is a unique feature among them. So if you look at the impacts out of the longer term, those corporate income tax changes might be more meaningful.
So, if growing your economy is what your goal is, if growing jobs and better jobs is your goal, which income bracket of people, and this is a rhetorical question, which income bracket of people is going to provide those jobs to others? Well, it's not the lower income people, right? It's going to be middle and upper income people. It's also going to be corporations and businesses. So when ISER is pointing out that a corporate income tax takes investment out of the economy, that's not a right or left statement. That is just a fact. So if you want to grow your economy, you find a way to tax, to raise revenue for your government that doesn't have the consequence of taking money out of the economy for investment in the economy. This is part of why Governor Dunleavy has introduced a reduction in the corporate income tax rate. And it is also why I introduced a reduction in the corporate income tax rate 2 years ago.
I want to present just one set of our results for you today. I'll direct you where you can find resources to take a look at some of the other results that we analyzed, but I want to look at results for employment. Generally speaking, employment is correlated with the other outcomes, meaning that Fiscal options that have large impacts on employment tend to have large impacts on personal income, on GDP, on the state's population. So these outcomes will be correlated across options, but we'll just, for the sake of brevity here, take a look at employment impacts. So what I'm going to show you is the employment impacts for using a particular fiscal option to generate $100 million in deficit reduction. That means we're going to use this fiscal option to pull $100 million out of the economy and use it to service a hypothetical state deficit. And so we're going to look at what the employment impacts are, both the direct impacts, so if we're using cuts to the state's workforce to generate those savings, obviously that would result in a layoff of a state employee, but that layoff would also generate indirect and induced impacts, spillover economic effects, as that employee is spending less of their income in the state's economy, which would generate further economic impacts. So I'm going to show you first employment results for what we call short-term static impacts. And when I say short-term, I mean over a 1 to 2 year time frame before the economy has time to adjust to this change. And when I say static impacts, what I mean is our modeling activity or our modeling assumptions don't account for behavioral changes that individuals might make. So for example, if the state implements a sales tax, for example, we might imagine that one response that consumers would have to that sales tax is they've got less disposable income. The price of goods and services that they're buying is going up. They got less money in their pocket to spend on other things. That has economic impacts. A second important impact of a change in prices is a change in relative prices. As I mentioned, some sales taxes, and we constructed them in this analysis, don't tax every category of expenditure. There might be substitution that consumers make from taxed and untaxed categories of goods. So if they see prices of taxed goods rising, they might purchase less of those and substitute their spending into untaxed items. So this doesn't account for that second form of behavioral change, where consumers are making substitution decisions. This is a static analysis in that way. So what you can see from these results is that, generally speaking, we see the following pattern: that changes to the state's expenditures result in the largest reduction in employment, in economic activity as measured through employment, again, in the short term and using these static assumptions. Whereas changes to the business tax environment, down here in the lower left-hand portion of the figure, result in smaller changes to employment.
I guess maybe just stop and think about it for a second, that out of all the things that the state can do that's going to impact the economy and employment, it is something to do with the state workforce. Meaning that's how significant the state workforce is to our GDP and our economy, right? We have grown our state spending somewhere between $18,000 and $20,000 per capita per person, way above the national average. Way above the national average. And so changes to your state workforce or to your budget, which would mean a change to your state workforce, is going to have a more significant impact to your economy, at least Alaska's economy. Maybe that isn't the case in other states that have a larger private sector.
Next, what we're going to do is use a separate modeling technique that allows us to explore dynamic effects. And when I say dynamic effects, this incorporates both the reduction in disposable income associated with pulling money out of the economy from these fiscal options, but it also allows consumers to adapt their behavior in.
Hey, I also want to say, before we get to the next point here, if you notice on the chart, dealing with PFDs, where does that come in? The permanent fund dividend. It's up near the more significant piece of it. Whereas a bunch of your taxes, like flat income tax, where's your seasonal narrower sales tax, come in below the permanent fund dividend. So whether you're reducing the dividend or paying a sales tax, you're being taxed, right? It's on the chart. It's government spending one way or the other.
In behavioral ways. So consumers now are going to have the opportunity to move from taxed to untaxed goods in the economy. But again, even when we're using this more sophisticated model, which allows for these dynamic adjustments to incorporate themselves, we still see that the most significant impacts come from reductions in state expenditures, while less significant impacts result from changes in the business tax environment. We also see that residential property tax now sort of falls into that same category, kind of on the lower end of the spectrum here. So these dynamic results, again, kind of in the short term. Here we're thinking about employment impacts in 2027, assuming that one of these options were adopted in FY 2024, which was the base year for our analysis, FY 2024. But what happens in the longer term? So as I mentioned, one of the things that we wanted to do here was shine our headlights as far out as they could, looking out to 2050. Generally speaking, you can characterize the impacts on the economy, the broad economic impacts of these fiscal options, and put them into three buckets. The first bucket are those with smaller economic impacts. Generally speaking, this is an important caveat, the smallest impacts on the economy or smaller impacts result from business tax changes. So these are changes more narrowly to the petroleum industry or to the broad corporate environment. More moderate changes result from changes to the permanent fund dividend distribution or from broad-based taxes. And then the largest economic impacts result from changes in state spending. Now, remember that ISER did not evaluate business tax changes in 2016, but for the options that ISER did evaluate then, these results are largely consistent with ISER's results from that previous study. Now, I mentioned a big caveat that generally speaking, economic impacts were more muted for these options. Corporate tax changes, contrasting to other options that we're analyzing here, their effects tend to grow over time, or at least persist for longer. For most of these other options, that over time the economy adjusts to changes in fiscal policy. Corporate tax changes, though, have this unique feature that they provide a deterrent to investment in the short run, and that investment, that foregone investment today, means that there's less economic activity that's generated from that investment in the future, and so those changes to the corporate tax structure tend to be more persistent. Which is a unique feature among them. So if you look at the impacts out of the longer term, those corporate income tax changes might be more meaningful. I want to present just one set of our results for you today. I'll direct you where you can find resources to take a look at some of the other results that we analyzed, but I want to look at results for employment.
I think I must have missed the end of that clip because this is sounding awful familiar. We're going to move on to the next clip here. I was wondering if that was him or me.
Here, what we see is that with more time to adjust, these economic impacts become a little bit more muted for some of these options. And so many of the economic impacts fall in their significance into that less significant category, but there's still persistent effects of these reductions in statewide expenditures. The second outcome that I mentioned that we evaluated, in addition to employment, income, GDP, and population, we asked this question of who would pay for implementing these fiscal options. How are higher and lower income households affected? Now, important caveat here that we didn't have the data or the policy specificity to evaluate how higher and lower income households would be affected by changes to state spending or to changes in business taxes. The reason that we can't evaluate changes in state spending and its impact on higher or lower income households is because it's heavily dependent on which programs the state is making changes to. So for example, if you think about a program like Medicaid or SNAP, which is heavily targeted at lower income households, they're obviously going to be disproportionately impacted by state spending changes. Whereas if we think about another category expenditure, like DOT expenditure on road maintenance, that's probably going to have a wider distribution of impacts between lower and higher income households. So it's heavily policy dependent. At the same time, we didn't have the data to evaluate how business tax changes might affect lower and higher income households. Generally speaking, the economics literature finds that when you change the business and tax environment, those changes are borne by three different groups of people. They're borne by the business owners themselves as they see reduced profitability, but they might simply just pass that tax on to their customers, and so their customers bear the incidence of that tax through higher prices. And employees might also be affected. Employers might pass that tax on to their employees through reduced hiring or compression in their wages. So, of the options that we evaluated, those options that changed household income, the PFD is generally found to be the most regressive option that we evaluated. And when I say regressive, I mean it has the highest impact on lower income households. At the opposite end of the spectrum, a progressive income tax is the most progressive. It has the largest impacts on the highest income households. Sales taxes, flat income taxes, and property taxes fall in between these two. So that result is what is illustrated in this figure here. On the left side of this figure, you can see how households that are at the lowest bracket of the income in Alaska are affected, and on the opposite side are the richest 10%. The vertical axis here is how many dollars these households would lose out on a per-person basis annually from these fiscal options. So as you can see, the PSD reductions are quite regressive. Lower income households would bear the largest incidence from reductions in the dividend. And in fact, what you see is that lower income households on so for $100 million in deficit reduction financed through PFD reductions, those would impact low income households to the tune of about $159 per person. Higher income households actually have less of their income reduced because of that. And the reason for that is that Alaskans pay federal income tax on their dividends. And so the federal government is picking up a portion of these dividend reductions for the higher income households. Because lower income Alaskans generally pay lower or no federal income tax, they pick up the full amount of that loss. On the opposite end of the spectrum is a progressive income tax. Higher income Alaskans would bear the most incidence from a progressive income tax. Lower income Alaskans would bear virtually none of that incidence. And then I mentioned these options in between. In order of their progressivity, a flat income tax, a narrow sales tax, a broad sales tax, and a property tax. I should also mention that higher income Alaskans would have the opportunity to reduce the incidence that they pay from these taxes by itemizing their federal income tax. So they can push off some of their state tax burden onto the federal government through itemized deductions.
Looks like chat's blowing up here. Let me see if I can catch up on some what you're participating here, whether you got some questions. I don't think the voters in Fairbanks will vote the tax cap out. Christopher. And JDM chose should drop the corporate income tax to 2%, but some will say that's too low. I think that's what the governor wants to do, and that's what I actually thought. Honestly, I would like to eliminate the corporate income tax myself, but dropping it from what is the highest in the nation, I think it's 9% or something like that, corporate income tax. I could get my numbers wrong right now, but we have one of the highest corporate income taxes in the nation. It's progressive, as our statutes say, it's progressive, but eliminating it to like a flat 2% was what I think my proposal was a couple of years ago. It's funny. The ISER did study a property tax, statewide property tax for people as an option, not as in they're recommending it, right? And I don't think anybody in the legislature is actually recommending it either. But yes, there is analysis here with regard to property tax. How much did our tax dollars pay this gentleman? That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that, but since the governor helped fund it, I'm sure we can find that answer out as to what the cost of this presentation, the cost of the research and cost of the presentation was. We'll make a note of that and see if we can't answer that question. Christopher, yeah, he did. Again, he mentioned the state property tax. I don't think that that's a very popular solution. I mean, that's less popular than a progressive income tax, and an income tax is not popular at all. At least it wasn't while I was in the legislature. So, JD agreed on eliminating it. I'm not sure what you're. Oh, it's Josh. Oh, okay, now I got you, Josh. Agreed on eliminating it. I'm not sure what you were referring to there. Yeah. So, again, just a reminder. This is just a presentation of options from research. It isn't a proposal for which one is better or right. It is just showing us what the research states for legislators and policymakers to figure out what the best policy is going forward. I think it's interesting that broad-based sales tax falls right in kind of in the middle here. When you're finding something that kind of meets the average or the the middle ground. Anyway, a couple more clips and then we're done for this evening. Let's jump to this next one.
A second component of this who pays question is how is the incidence or the distribution of burden allocated between Alaska residents, non-residents that commute up here to work, visitors in our economy, and the federal government through reductions in federal income tax. I'll note again that we didn't evaluate the state spending changes or business tax changes for this who pays dimension. We assumed that for the purposes of our economic impact analysis that those would be completely borne by Alaska residents, but it's certainly true that the actual amounts are likely lower than that, important to consider. For the options that we did evaluate, these gray bars represent how much of every dollar that the state would raise from these different options would come out of the pockets of Alaska residents. So for every dollar raised from a PFD reduction, for example, 86 cents of that dollar would be raised from Alaska residents. Non-residents, the green bars here, you can see have virtually no contribution to PFD reductions, right? Non-residents of Alaska do not receive dividends unless they are out migrating that same year. So there's a small sliver of green there that accounts for that out migration of Alaskans that are still receiving their dividends. The yellow bar represents federal income tax payments. And because those higher income Alaskans are no longer paying federal income tax, we're not bearing the full cost of dividend reductions within state. And so the federal government is picking up about a 13% share of the tab there. Property taxes have a similar incidence of about 83 or 86% or 86 cents for every dollar raised would be paid by Alaskans. And that's because Alaskans own a large share of residential property in the state. Out-of-state residents account for a smaller share of residential property ownership. At the other end of the spectrum, the options that would have the lowest incidence for Alaskans are sales tax options. A broader-based sales tax would tax Alaskans to the tune of about 76 cents for every dollar raised, while a more exclusive sales tax would raise about 73 cents from Alaskans for every dollar raised. The balance of that would be paid by non-residents, either visitors or commuters to the state, and by the federal government through the opportunity for higher income Alaskans to deduct their sales taxes from their federal income taxes. I mentioned one of the things that we did in this analysis was we looked at a couple of variations of the options that I just described. One variation of these options was to consider a flat income tax for the state of about 2%. And imagine that Alaskans were able to deduct from their state income tax liability either a portion or all of their permanent fund dividend. What this would do is it would allow Alaskans to claim as that credit against their federal income tax, or Alaskans would no longer pay federal income tax on that dividend. It's just a state income tax credit. And so more of the incidence would be pushed off onto the federal government. But our incidence shared by those non-resident workers would remain, right? People that work in Alaska would still contribute to state's income tax, but would not be subject to receipt of a PFD tax credit. One of the other variations that we considered was a seasonal sales tax. Same intention here. How much of this incidence can we reduce on Alaskans and shift to either our non-resident workers, our visitors, or the federal government? So one way to do that is with a seasonal sales tax. Several communities, and particularly in Southeast Alaska, where we have a lot of tourism, already deploy this strategy to try to shift more of that incidence onto the visitor industry. The idea here is that with higher rates in the summer when the visitors show up and lower rates throughout the rest of the year when it's only Alaskans buying goods and services, non-residents, particularly visitors, would pick up more of the tab. The effect of a seasonal sales tax is that for every dollar raised, Alaskans' disposable income would increase by 2 to 5 percentage points relative to the option without a seasonal tax. So we're able to save Alaskans 2 to 5 cents by adopting, or for every dollar raised, by adopting the seasonal sales tax model. I want to note an important limitation of our work is that we didn't analyze regional variation, but we recognize that there's important variations in these economic impacts across regions of the state based on those regions' pre-existing local taxes, the distribution of income across regions, and the local cost of goods and services. A second component of this
So that last point that he made about the regional impact, especially for sales tax, where one, regions have sales tax already, or two, regions don't have an economy like Western Alaska, and any sort of sales tax is felt heavier out there. One of the things that the state can do is figure out some sharing mechanism amongst jurisdictions, among cities and boroughs, to share in that state sales tax to kind of to even out the impact of that statewide sales tax. But at the end of the day here, and we got one more clip that I want to show. But at the end of the day here, what the legislature really needs to do for the health of Alaska is figure out what the right combination is. What are the right levers to move to set the state into a better fiscal situation going forward? That's what we need to have the conversations about. That's what the Fiscal Policy Working Group was all about in 2021. The fiscal plan that the governor is putting forward is similar to the Fiscal Policy Working Group recommendations. Again, those recommendations were bicameral, meaning both the House and the Senate members participated, and they were bipartisan. Both Republicans and Democrats and independents were involved in the conversation. And the outcome of that was what was felt at the time was a path forward, and what was necessary which levers were necessary to move in order to find a political agreement to adjust this economic framework. So now we've got a plan by the governor, and will the legislature take it up? Remains to be seen. All right, getting to the last clip here, and looks like we've got a couple comments. I'm going to jump over to the chat window here. Let's see. Good question, Miguel. Do you believe our state needs its own Doge? Yeah, I do. I think that, and I just got back to doing a little bit of writing today, and this will come out later, but the way to reduce our spending in this state has to be with a Doge or similar effort. It is looking at how we are doing things in state government instead of just applying a across the board hatchet cut to the budget as a way to get to a more lean, more efficient state government. And you're not going to get the legislature to do that very easily during session. It's just too complex. So yeah, I think there has to be an outside the legislative session effort to do something like that. And you got another good question here, Miguel. Do we really think Alaskans believe if there is a sales tax approved that our state government would actually honor it sunsetting? And that's, you're asking because the governor's put a sunset into the sales tax. That is a legit and reasonable question. Once government gets its hooks in something, spending wise, it is not likely to give it up. So the question is, do you want to give up your dividend? Do you want to give up having the government take more in the form of taxes, right? All of those, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're taking more dividend or giving more in taxes, right? The government is getting more of money that you have, and that is the perennial question. That is the battle that happens in every state, in every jurisdiction, with every government. Every government wants more. There's always somebody that wants more spending, and that's the battle that has to be fought. You have to stay vigilant year after year, generation after generation. You have to stay vigilant. You can't. There's not a way to create a system where you don't have to fight the government for money. Look at it from the federal government perspective. How much growth has happened with federal government in our lifetime? It's huge now. Some of that growth, about a quarter of the budget, so a quarter of that growth has been financed by free money, by debt. We don't have a balanced budget. We're growing things in governments. You can just basically say that any federal dollars that are coming to you, a quarter of them are being financed. Our future taxpayers are going to pay for it. So even if you've got a way to create free money, you still have, consequences for that. You still have a government that's going to grow to consume all of that free money. And then you end up, not only is the government or you are impacted by the dollar figures that have been raised, right? Either through taxes or through debt, but you've got a larger government. I'm first and foremost a limited government guy. So I want the system, I want the fiscal structure and the systems, the levers that the government that the government has. I want those created where it puts it's the hardest for the government to grow every year. Not that it can't grow, because it does need to, just to cover inflationary costs. Population costs, right? As population grows, there are reasons why there's additional spending, but it has to be tied to your fiscal engine and ability to pay for it, right? Anyway, okay. It's the same concern I have. I mean, in 1913, the federal income tax was sold as temporary. Yeah, and I understand that. I totally get the hesitancy to take the governor serious and take anybody serious that says, hey, we need to create a broad-based tax. One of the things that ought to strike you is the difference, the disproportionate impact between state spending and the private economy on that graph. The reason is because we do not have a large private sector economy. Outside of the oil industry, we don't. They say it's growing, but I didn't see a graph that showed us by how much. If you want to have a stronger private sector, and I'm all I can say is get elected and go to the legislature so that you can learn for yourself what I'm about to say. The state legislature does not care about that small portion of the economy that is the private sector. It doesn't care. It doesn't care. When you measure care based on spending decisions, right? Where do we take money? It doesn't care. It's not it doesn't impact these spending decisions at the state level. It's oil money and permanent fund earnings that impact. So doing things that would, like capital budget spending. I talked the other night about capital budget and how we have a challenge between the operating budget being so large and the capital budget being small, right? Capital budget's what's going to, improve the roads and the infrastructure and the things that would enable economic growth. That takes a back seat to operation spending. That capital spending is important to economic growth. There's less pressure, there's less demand for larger capital budgets than there is operating budgets, state jobs. That's what the legislature cares about. It cares about state jobs. It doesn't care about private sector jobs because they don't impact what's happening in Juneau. Anyway, I feel like I'm a broken record. Let's get to this last clip here. We're running out of time.
Where we have seen more significant change from the ISER 2016 results, and this is where I said that there were subtle but important differences, is recall this slide that I shared with you that showed the allocation of incidents, who would pay for these various fiscal options. When ISER did this analysis in 2016, all of these gray bars were the same. They existed in a range between 82 and 84%. So residents would pick up almost the same tab regardless of which fiscal option we implemented. Here, as we sit in 2026, that's not the case anymore. Because of the growth in our visitor industry, because of the change in composition of our non-resident workforce, and because particularly of the changes in the federal tax code, Alaskans are going to have to pick up more of the tab from certain fiscal options, particularly changes in the permit fund dividend or statewide income tax, than they would from a sales tax. So the incidence from a sales tax has been reduced since 2016, while the incidence from an income tax has grown. The last thing that I want to do today is share with you some tools where you can, or some other information that you can use that might be helpful as you're interpreting some of this data. Launching after this presentation today is going to be a new page on the ISER website where you can download these slides and, in fact, all 160 slides from my presentation if you want to go over all 160 of them, which God love you if you do. But all 160 slides will be available online. But also available online is this tool that we put together that you can use to build your own fiscal plan. What this tool does is it shows you how these various options could be combined together and the outcomes that they generate. So I want to.
As he's talking about this, I'm going to throw up the link to the ISER's website. So if you want to go find this on their website, as soon as they get it published, they probably have already. You can go look at it yourself.
So I want to point you in that direction. I think that this is useful, potentially modeling particular plans. And while it can't capture every feature of a fiscal plan with the level of detail that you might want, for example, to create a fiscal note, I think it can give you sort of a broad sense of how these fiscal options could net out as they're combined together. So
I created one of those spreadsheets similar to that while I was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and gave the legislators an opportunity to move the levers and see what kind of changes would impact our decisions there in Juneau 2 years ago. So this is not a new concept. It is a tool. It's an Excel spreadsheet, it looks like, to visualize, you know, if I do one thing, how does it impact another? And some smart people put together the spreadsheet, legislative finance, in order to help us visualize what our options are. So again, if this was interesting and you want to have an opportunity to hear it again, or participate in the webinar that's coming up, you can do that. All right. So the link that's here will take you to the ISER website, and that website you can find the link to the webinar, or I've got I just showed you the webinar link. So if you click on that link, you're going to see the webinar. That's where you're gonna go register for the webinar. So, all right. That's coming up here Wednesday. And I'll probably be participating in that. I find this interesting, and I think it's going to be impactful of the legislative, the process in Juneau. So anyway, let me see let me see what else we got here on the chats. You guys have been active tonight. I really appreciate you showing up and the encouragement. We also need to get rid of all the vacant positions our state has had for years. Yeah, no kidding. There's a really easy save when you're talking about cuts or reductions in the budget. There's a lot of positions that are never filled, haven't been filled for years, and that money gets spent. It's just kind of a big slush fund for managers to help grease the skids of government. And it is a poor way to manage our state government. Can I post the link in chat? Yeah, if you give me a quick second here, the ISER website link is right here. It's right here. There you go. So there's the ISER Alaska link for the website. Let's see. Supposedly the housing market has gone up by 40% in Alaska, and the rest has inflated by about 20 to 25% over the past 6 years with the CPI, with inflation. You know, I don't know the veracity of that. I don't know how accurate that is, but sounds like it is. I mean, what you hear is property tax valuations going up, so it would make sense. Did not hear him say anything about our state's vacant job positions that have not been filled. Yeah, they're not going to study the vacant positions. That is kind of down in the weeds more than what their higher level discussion or research was for here. They weren't actually looking for areas of government that could stand to be cut, right? That wasn't the purpose of the study. That wasn't what the governor asked them to study. That's another way to put it. He asked them to look at the large, big picture fiscal items that can be done by the legislature and by the governor to fix this structural deficit problem. Anyway, well, we're over an hour here, and I want to respect your time and mine and stay consistent. So again, Oversight Live exists because we don't have a road to Juneau, and it's cost prohibitive for people to get there. And I've got 6 years of experience in the legislature that I want to make available to people through my insight in legislative ongoings and answering your questions. So that's why Oversight Live exists. And we're going to endeavor to provide some content every night that the legislature's in session here with pertinent stuff. Again, I can't cover everything that's in the legislature. I'm a one-man show here. But I will attempt to figure out what is pertinent, what is the most important things that we should know about that's happening on a regular basis, and bring that to you for your awareness. And increasing that awareness means you can provide better oversight over your government, right? It's important. So with that, I am going to throw this up here again. If you got questions watching this recording, email me, producer@oversightlive.com, and we'll do our best to get an answer back to you. Okay, thanks all for joining us on the 3 socials: Facebook, YouTube, and X. And until tomorrow night, we'll see you. Have a good night.